All right, so welcome everyone. Today's session is on resumes and CVs. I'm Kay Gruder, pronouns she, her, and I'm Associate Director for Graduate Student and Postdoc Career Opportunities. Kristen?
Yeah, and I am Kristen Soprano, pronouns she, her, and I am a career consultant here in the Center for Career Development. And so today we are actually going to spend some time, sorry about that, I put myself on mute and then forgot to unmute myself. Today we are going to spend some time talking to you a little bit more about resumes and CVs and the differences between those two. But before we do really get into that, we wanted to just make some mention of the career competencies that you see here displayed on the screen. These are ultimately the essence of what most individuals will want to display throughout their documents. We know through the National Association of Colleges and Employers that these are the 8 essential critical elements that employers are looking for in order to determine if an individual is career ready, and that will also help determine post-graduation success for individuals. So really thinking a little bit more about how individuals are displaying these through their documents, whether that be resume, CV, or demonstrating to employees in the future will be key to their ongoing success.
All right, in today's session, we have a number of different topics. We'll talk about the differences and similarities in CVs and resumes. We'll talk about ATS, which stands for Applicant Tracking Systems, and the need to be strategic in your document content and format. We'll preview a few content sections that are kind of the most common in all of the different documents. We'll spend some time on bullet point statements and what makes an effective bullet point statement, and then some overall strategic considerations. So this is like the biggest question I usually get when I sit down to do career coaching with graduate students. They will often ask me what's the difference between a resume and a CV. And it's what we're providing today is really within the US context. And I often like this image of the blender, in that the CV would be all the fruits and vegetables, in that it's all the content that an individual has to share from their college education forward. It's the education, the work, the research, the publications, the presentations, the service to the university or external to the university, and so forth. So we know that the CV can be as many pages as it needs to be. And it might be a 3-page document, a 5-page document, or longer for individuals who are farther into their career. When we think about the resume, this is where we think about selecting fruits and vegetables. It is content that is recent and relevant to the kind of opportunity that the individual is applying to. Typically 1 to 2 pages. Some industry areas are really insistent on 1 page. Doctoral students often have a 2-page resume. And there's other areas where, like teaching, healthcare, where there's some practicum, pre-professional experiences that are also included. And that also usually makes for a longer resume document. So always good to have a 1-page version. You could definitely have a 2-page version. And then the CV is the longer document. As we think about these documents, we like to think about them as strategic documents, not just lists, not just repositories of content. So in doing that, it's helpful to think about, well, what are the goals? What are my goals for my CV or resume? And what are the employer's goals? And basically, we all want to get our materials read, right? Get your resume or CV read, strategically feature your academic qualifications, your skills, your strengths, your experience and knowledge, and then show alignment with the position or opportunity that you're applying to. And then obtain an invitation to interview. In terms of the employer really wants to compare you to other applicants. They want to understand your alignment to the position or opportunity, and they want to see what added value you might bring. So you'll want to always match your content, like use recent and relevant content, but then think about what else can I leverage from my background that the employer might be interested in. The employer is also looking to narrow the pool of applicants. They are not sitting around saying, oh, I wish we could keep everyone. They're really very quickly trying to determine, these are our top choices to bring into an interview process.
So when you think about being strategic in how you're creating that document, there's really two different audiences that you need to consider in relation to that. One is the idea of the human reader. The other is the idea of the computer reader. So again, specifically for those applicant tracking systems, how are you formatting your content? How are you optimizing keywords that the computer is going to pick up on? That strategic aspect is essential with this document. So now when you think a little bit more about how you're going to be strategic in that aspect, it's really understanding a little bit more about the way that the ATS works. We do offer specifically pre-recorded sessions on ATS that you can find on our websites, but just looking over this a little bit more, you really want to understand a little bit more about those keyword searches, how those ATS are scoring and looking at things. They're also not just looking at those keywords, but they're also looking at dates. They're looking at that to determine levels of experience. They're using that on formatting. Is it simple because ATS are being programmed to read just this information should appear here and it should read straight across. They don't know how to read graphs and up and down. So knowing that, while a visual appealing resume might have columns of information, knowing that the system is reading straight across. Well, yes, it looks pretty for the human. It may not be as compatible for that computer. You can see there are some resources that we do have listed here on this slide that again will be made available to you afterwards. So we do encourage you to look through those. This is just a sample of what one screen of an ATS might look like. There are multiple different platforms and systems of ATS and even different versions within one platform as well. But on here you can just see how this one particular applicant, if you look over there on the left-hand corner there, you can see how the applicant the system tracks everything from how many applications the individuals has submitted. You can see a little bit more about the different overall scoring and techniques, the source of application, which is also just as important. So that computer is really picking up a lot more detail than that first human is.
So it's important as you create your content and you think about your format to really have some key questions in mind. And the first question is, what is the goals for each of my content sections? What am I going to include in each of my content sections? And what do I want to emphasize? With these kinds of documents, you always have a choice about the narrative that you're going to share, and we'll talk more about that when we get into bullet point statements. The order of the content is also pretty important, not so much for an applicant tracking system in that those systems just scan through the document looking for matches, but for the human reader, the placement of content can be pretty important. And then looking back after you craft your content and look at your format, does the approach I've chosen really achieve the goals that I have for this document? So these are just kind of some questions to keep in mind as you go through either revising or creating content sections. The first content section is typically the contact information. There doesn't need to be any header there in terms of contact information. You just start with your name typically, and then whatever level of contact information you want to give. And so you can see here there are three options. Option one shows the individual's name, Jonathan Husky, phone number, email, and their LinkedIn. And you'll notice that what's missing from here is any sort of geographic identifiable information. So there's no address, there's no city, state, or anything like that. Option 2 has the same information, but we do notice here that the individual has added Vernon, Connecticut. So there is some identifiable geographic information. And with these two options, what you're really doing is you're trying to work the ATS system. So if I was applying for a job in Houston, Texas, and I lived in Vernon, Connecticut, I would not want to put Vernon, Connecticut in my address section. And that's because ATS can be set up to really look at candidates from a geographic area. They could have it set 50 miles. We only want to bring in people 50 miles from Houston. So by not having the Vernon, Connecticut, it's actually helping me get through that applicant tracking system. And then on the flip side, if I'm applying for something, let's say in Hartford, Connecticut, and I want to signal that I'm right here in Vernon, I would put Vernon, Connecticut. But the idea of having like a residential address is not something that is part of resumes or CVs. It used to be, but it's not a common practice now. And then if individuals using a CV for an academic job, this is where we would see the individual use their department's, academic department's address. The next section below the contact information might be a qualification section. So again, thinking strategically. If I'm applying for a position, then it is really a strong practice to have a qualification section appear next. And that's for two reasons. One is that it's a place where I can match quite a bit of the job posting by identifying the ways that I have experience, knowledge, and training that are in that job posting. So it helps with the applicant tracking system. It also helps for the human reader who, starts at the top of the document and starts reading through, and the human reader gets to see how the individual is immediately qualified for the position. And the qualifications section might have 3 bullet point statements. I wouldn't recommend more than probably 5 bullet point statements, but you can see here that each of the bullet point statements is identifying something significant about the person's skills, knowledge, experience. This person, 6 years of experience in whatever it might be, specific expertise in this technique or that technique, proficient maybe in some different things. In this case, programming knowledge and a strong background in something else. Doesn't have to be 5 bullet point statements, but you do want to pick aspects of what you have to offer that matches the position that you're applying to. Qualifications is really pretty popular for anyone at the graduate student level to have on a resume or a CV for industry. The times that we see a CV used in industry is often for research and development kinds of positions.
So now if we think about that, how that compares to a general resume, typically on those 1 to 2 page standard resumes, you're not going to see the qualifications directly listed under the contact information. Instead, what you might see is going to be something that looks a little bit more like an objective or a summary. Typically with most undergraduate students, we tend to steer a little bit more towards that idea of an objective. Really, the purpose of an objective is just to be about 1 to 2 lines of text that just simply outlines 3 main things: what the individual is looking for, what the author is looking for, where they are looking for that, and what they are willing to offer to the reader. So you can see some examples here. What they are looking for could be a specific job, an internship. Maybe they're applying to a specific name, knowing that they're always going to be, excuse me, tailoring that resume. Where they're looking for it, that might be where they're speaking about a specific company name or industry they're looking to gain experience in. And then what they're offering usually are some relatable skills that might be matching, again, the terminology that they're seeing in the job description, or skill sets that or competencies that are directly relevant and needed for that particular industry or area. The summary is also something that you might see on an individual that has a little bit more experience. So maybe they've got too much experience that they're just trying to figure out, how do I put this onto 1 or 2 pages? Or if they're really forced into that 1 page, but they're leaving so much extra off about them that's helpful to know. The summary provides them a little bit more of an opportunity to expand into a little bit more of an elevator pitch style addition to their resume. This is where it really gives them the opportunity to share information that's not otherwise known on that document. That could be things like they're looking to relocate. So maybe they don't have the geographic location that Kay was talking about, but they're specifically calling out in there that they're willing to relocate to a different area. Again, that experience that was removed due to a resume. So maybe they have a lot of extensive experience in higher ed, but they're looking to move more into an industry focus where they had to focus just on that directly related information, but still want to incorporate the aspect of having, 5+ years teaching experience, for example. And again, some other unique skill sets or qualifications or certifications that they might have as well. Following those 3 optional sections that we just discussed, typically what will always follow next is the education section. So as you can see on here, education and highlighting that on your resume is very important. There are a few things that you do want to keep in mind when writing out the education section. As with other standard sections on your resume or CV, you want to think about writing that in reverse chronological order. So that would be what is happening currently or what was happening most recently, and working backwards from there. You can see in this particular example, the individual outlining their PhD and then working backwards with their master's and bachelor's. Also the month and year of completion. Typically on a resume format, it's not needed to have both the start and end date with education, more so just the month and year in which that degree was awarded is what readers are looking for. The idea of GPA is something that could also be included on here. Typically not for individuals once they're pursuing a doctorate, but definitely master's, bachelor's are things that you do want to include in there. And when listing the GPA, you want to make sure that it's being indicated out of the scale and keeping those decimal numbers equal. So if you're indicating that you have a 3.82, you'd want to make sure that you're indicating that out of a 4.00. Other things that you might see included in the education section here might be a dissertation or thesis title. If you think it's relevant to, again, the subject of what you're applying for, certainly including that under education is a recommendation. However, you feel it's not really directly related, or if it's maybe something that might only be known by a certain few individuals and you're really looking for that space saver, those are things that you might want to think about removing from there as well. And this is just another sample here of the education format, how you can list out your degrees when you have degrees from multiple degrees from the same institution. Shortening the idea of the university name that's on brand if you're going to be reflecting or referring to it that way throughout the rest of the documentation as well. You'll also notice on this particular sample here that the degrees are actually abbreviated. So this is also something you want to think back to when you think about optimizing for the ATS. If the job description is specifically indicating that an individual has a master's of science, you want to make sure that you are writing out those words and then maybe putting the abbreviation of your degree in parentheses after that. You can see that on this sample here. As we go back, thank you, Kay. As we go back to this one, certainly just listing the abbreviations if you're seeing that that's how it's matching is okay.
We had one question, sorry. Let me pull this up. One of the questions is, some say that if education is 10 plus years old, it should be removed. Is this an old school of thought now?
Yeah, so in Kay, you can certainly jump in on this. I would say from the resume perspective, if it's 10 plus years or older, sometimes what we might encourage then is thinking about having it at the bottom of the document if space prefers. In those instances, if you're 10 years past your education, you certainly have a lot more professional and relevant skills to showcase, which is what your audience is most likely going to be looking at first. So in that case, if space permits, suggest moving it to the bottom to still show the award or degree, because even in those types of positions, they might be still looking for bachelor's required, master's required. Kay, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add to that.
Sure, absolutely correct with that. I would also say that because ageism is a thing, that what I've started to see more often is that it'll be on the bottom. People will identify the institution and the degree, but they may not actually put like a month and year for graduation. So that's another pretty common practice around that as well. Yeah, thank you for asking.
So now when you think about not only the content that you are putting on your resume, you also want to give careful thought to where that content falls within the document itself. So this slide really illustrates a way that you can think about for a single page document or a multi-page document. As we know, most individuals don't typically, especially when it comes to resumes, they don't typically read them word for word. They typically spend about 15, 20, 25 seconds skimming the document, again, looking for those keywords, looking for the things that really jump off the page at their eyes. So in gamifying the idea of writing a resume, you really want to think about, how am I going to keep my reader engaged with this as long as possible? And that's by keeping their eyes moving down the page, but then also giving them something to move into the page. So if you thought about splitting a single document into horizontal thirds like we have here, really think about that top third of the document, outlining all the information that your reader immediately needs to know about you at first glance to decide if they're going to keep reading further. Need to know information would include your contact information. Again, we possibly talked about the geographic location. How can they get a hold of you? If you have your LinkedIn profile, how can I learn more about you? The objective, the summary, the qualifications. Are you exhibiting those minimum things that we're looking for, giving us the information we need to know about why we should continue? Again, education, as we just talked about, again with that last question too, on depending upon how long you've been in the industry. And then potentially maybe some relevant courses or skills that you've taken. Those might flip-flop in the areas of where they occur. But what's going to give them that immediate checkbox to say, yep, let's move on. From there, their eyes will continue into the information that they want to know. This is where you're going to think about outlining the information that they want to see that makes them think, yes, you would be a good hire. Yes, you can perform the functions of this role, where you start demonstrating similar positions you've held in the past, or the relevant skill sets and competencies you have that transfer into what they're looking for. Once they've taken on to that and say, okay, yes, this individual, this is somebody we want to talk to more, how do we get to just know more about them? What else makes them unique? This is where then ideally they would move into the third section of your resume, which is the nice to know information. So again, this is where you can outline maybe some of those other skill sets that you have, or experiences you have that give you that added oomph in the application process, that give you a little bit more advantage maybe over some other applicants of information that maybe they don't have. And this is where I say that the skills can really fluctuate. As you see on this sample here, the skills are towards the bottom. But let's say you're applying for a position in which they specifically state that they need somebody with R, Python, Excel experience. That's where you're going to want to move those skill sets up into that need to know information to really make sure that they're seeing that at first glance. Again, this could be something with how you figure out that single page document, or if you have a 9-page CV, making sure those first 3 pages focus on here's everything they need to know, the next 3 pages what they want to know, and then the remaining 3 pages of that nice to know. So it still works with that multi-page document as well. When you think about the content that is fitting within each of those different sections, specifically on a resume, you can see some samples over here on the left of different types of content areas you might choose to talk about. Past work experience, leadership, volunteer experience, conferences, organizations that you're a part of, presentations or publications that you've been a part of. All these are really great things to add on there. But the main focus when adding this information is making sure that you are including the core 4, what we refer to as the core 4 in this. Those 4 elements provide your reader with the name of the organization of where you're working, so they get a better understanding of where these accomplishments have occurred. The title that you held within that could be member, volunteer, a specific formal job title, the city and state of where that occurred. And again, the start and end dates. These should be in month-year format. You don't need to worry about the specific dates, but including that month, year, start and end, because again, this is where ATS or human readers are going to be looking at to kind of do that math in between those months or years to try and get a better assessment of that level of experience that you do have. This is just one particular example that we put together that shows some of these elements of what we talked about. You can see how this individual chose to include a work experience section on their resume, where they are most likely listing out all the work experiences they had to show off those skill sets that they've used, those impacts that they've made to those organizations. You can see how they've utilized the core 4 here. And what's really important on this is making sure that your font and formatting is consistent throughout the document. So you can see here how they chose to bold the name of their company and use italics in their job title. So that's something that really helps your reader's eye digest what they're looking at on the page. So as they're scrolling through and skimming through all of your information, they can kind of say, okay, if I see something that is in all capitals and bold, that means I'm switching to a different topic. If I see something that's just bolded, that tells me I'm switching my mindset to a different organization or place, or italics. These are the multiple positions or titles they've had. So that consistency also helps your reader digest the information that they're looking for.
And here's an example with research experience. This is a section as is teaching experience, which we will look at next. Pretty common to CVs to have both of those sections. So with research experience, we can see here that the individual has decided to have the university in bold, so that draws some attention to where this is occurring. They've also decided to have their title in bold. And you might, if you're in a lab, you could certainly include the name of a lab. Sometimes individuals will include the name or title of like the name and title of a PI or a lead that is in the research lab. And then it's common to have a research focus indicated. Another option that I see here a lot is to, let's say somebody has sort of 3 projects going on. They might have research focus 1, research focus 2, research focus 3 with little descriptions of those. They might have unique bullet point statements for each of those research focus areas, or they might list all 3 of the areas of focus and then collectively have bullet point statements. So what we're offering today are just kind of examples of some of the ways that people choose to organize these sections. The key is, as long as you're consistent and that people are finding the information that you want them to find, you can try different options. Certainly, it's just whatever you choose, follow it through the entire section. You can see here too that these bullet point statements all begin with action verbs. This is nice for the human reader. It's great for the ATS too, provided you've matched what's in the job posting. But for the human reader can just immediately skim down through here and say, oh, this person has investigated, characterized, inspected, designed. And that really helps the human. It solidifies for the human that the person probably has the skills or knowledge or experience that they're looking for, provided those words are aligned with what's showing up in the, let's say, job or internship description. You'll also notice here that these bullet point statements have periods at the end. They don't have to, but again, whatever you choose, stick to it. So if you're using periods, use them throughout all the bullet point statements. We'll dive into teaching here. A couple of options for teaching. Again, there are many ways that this could be set up. Here we see that the emphasis is on the university, that's in bold, instructor of record, the title is in bold. And then this person has chosen to feature the couple of courses that they are an instructor of record, and then to kind of collectively say, in these two courses, these 3 bullet point statements represent the work that I'm doing. These could be separated with separate bullet point statements, or they could be collectively done in this way. Again, we see that the person has developed syllabi, established a capstone project, increased class involvement by introducing some approach. You always have a choice of the narrative. Let me hop back here. You always have a choice of the narrative, meaning if you were applying for a teaching intensive position, you might want to put the kinds of approaches you use, the number of students, the kinds of students, the kind of technology that you're using in the classroom, and so forth. So teaching is always a good one to think about, well, what narrative do I want to share here?
We have another question.
Okay.
The question is, does the tense that is used matter throughout the resume?
Past experience is past tense, current experience, present tense. However, there is some discussion out there about how ATS systems want the action verbs to be in the same tense that's used in the job posting or the internship posting. So I don't know, Chris, do you have any more insight on that?
Yeah, I would say the easiest way to look at it is exactly what you said, Kay. Past experience is past, current, present. When it comes down to the ATS, we try to match the ATS as best as possible, but you're never going to beat an ATS, and nobody will ever score 100% on an ATS. They are specifically designed that way. There's even questions that arise in the idea too, well, what if I'm currently doing the job, but I only worked on one project one time, then I only have one bullet that's in past tense and others that are all in present. So the best that you can do is, again, try to stick to that consistency as possible and do what you feel to be best in that particular instance.
Thank you. This is another option for teaching. This would be if really you just wanted to signal to the employer, I've taught, and these are the titles of the courses I taught. So you can see in this example, there are no bullet point statements. So if you're looking to shorten a CV where teaching is important in terms of just showing, like, I do this kind of work and communication and interaction with individuals, you might adopt this approach to at least preserve all the teaching that has been done. But if the teaching really is being leveraged, or the teaching is exactly what you're applying for, you would use the bullet point statement approach. And it's not to say things like I graded papers. It's really to identify more uniquely what skills, knowledge, and training you're using in your role as an instructor or a TA.
Yeah, so that brings us really nicely into the idea of, well, how do I write these bullet statements that Chris and Kay have been talking so much about, and how do I really make sure I'm bringing in these action verbs? So the way I like to pose it to students personally is think of these bullet statements as really your sales pitch, as your marketing pitch to the reader on, if you're looking for somebody who can fill this role, here's how I've done it before and why. So there are three main components that you really try to think about incorporating into each bullet statement you write. And that's what you're seeing here: the what you did, the how you did it, and the why you did it. So the what is typically where you're inserting one of those action verbs, leading with really that strong action verb that resonates the most with what your reader is looking for. Again, that idea of they're skimming, we read left to right, we're going to skim down the left margin where my bullets start. So how do I draw their eye in to the right? So that strong action verb that details that skill. The how, this is where you tell exactly a little bit more about how you performed that skill. This could be, again, talking through another action verb. This could be demonstrating a technical skill set that you might have, talking about your manipulation of data in Excel and different formulas or format or functionalities of Excel that you're familiar with, or specific programming language you used. And then the why really helps show that impact, that outcome. Why was it important for you to perform this task and this work? What benefit did that play to the company, the organization, or the people that you were supporting? These three elements are really helpful in beginning to construct that bullet, and potentially even having that finalized bullet. But in some cases, you're not always going to have these three elements, but really just showing more of those significant tasks and the accomplishments are what you want to draw your reader's attention to with these. On this slide, we have a little bit more just of an example of these three elements in action, and the idea of kind of a good, better, best. So you can see here the idea of investigated root causes to lost property. Okay, well, that's a start, but it's just very basic. It just says, here's what I did. If we think about including a little bit more to that, investigated root causes of loss to property by conducting, okay, you put a word in here that metallurgical, if I pronounced that
You got it.
correct,
You got it.
and materials analysis and testing. It's giving a little bit more context to the how, right? That second element of what we're looking for. But really, when you think about how can I really showcase these elements, investigated the root causes of lost property by conducting metallurgical and materials analysis and testing to determine the evidence of structural corrosion. That now sees, okay, I understand the importance of what you were doing with this particular task. And in some cases, really even thinking a little bit more about, are there ways I can quantify that? Is there some ways that I can show that that you improved efficiency by a certain percentage, or that you had to investigate root cause of over 14 different property losses, right? So thinking a little bit more of how can I incorporate that even to make it best is always helpful. We briefly touched upon the idea of skills earlier in the document when we were reviewing the rules of thirds, the need to know, want to know, nice to know. But just to quickly circle back to this, having a strong skills section on your resume or your CV is always going to be an added benefit. The types of information that you really want to think about including in this are going to refer to those hard, technical, measurable skills that you have. As you can see in here, the subcategories under the skills that the individual is highlighting are their software skill sets that they have, their technical skill sets. We often might see people in here focusing on certifications they have, lab techniques they're familiar with. So anything in those, it doesn't have to be reserved for just computer skills in here. Languages, if you speak multiple languages. All great things to put in here, and also sometimes including the idea of your proficiency or your familiarity within those skill sets. This is again where you can further showcase that fluency or proficiency by incorporating these skills into your bullet statements. So again, instead of something as simple as saying I used Excel to create graphs, data graphs, well, you can say a little bit more about how you used pivot tables within Excel to create data graphs, or how you used specific equations to determine, to analyze and sort data. So really thinking a little bit more about how you can demonstrate the skill sets to bring specific attention to your reader, whether that's the human or the computer, but also generate a little bit more of those keyword searches is always going to be, again, as I said before, an added benefit.
Yeah, and I'll just add on this one that the applicant tracking systems are also keeping track of how many times some of these key skills and keywords appear. And I know when I first started out in this field, it was like, oh, you would never repeat anything on a resume. But that is not the case anymore. So for example, if I don't know if R is important to the position that you're applying to, and let's say in your qualifications section, you put that you have some expertise, experience, proficiency with R, that could go in the qualifications section. It could show up here in the technical section or in the skills section. And it could also be included in one of your bullet point statements for, whether it's your work experience, your research, or wherever it might appear there. So these systems are actually happy to find things multiple times when they're written into the job descriptions. So we're going to step into another content section with CVs. We have publications and presentations, and we follow the formal citation for whatever our academic discipline is. There's nothing really there to do within a CV other than follow, how it's been done and how it is done. I would say that something I have seen a little more recently is when individuals have a long list of citations, they sometimes will do things like divide those up. They may say like a poster presentation. So under a presentations section, they might have things like poster presentations or conference poster presentations. And then in there, they might have something like invited talks. And so we see this too with publications where people may tease out, high impact journal publications or in review or submitted. And that's usually just to try and help the human reader. Applicant tracking system doesn't care about that, but it helps the human reader sort of go through what could be a page or more of content about publications or presentations, right? So let me hop over. So again, presentations. And then the real trick though is on a shorter document, on a 1 or 2 page resume, you still want to preserve some of this great work, research, evidence of what you've done. And so, what can you do in that situation? You don't have the luxury of having all of the citations. So there are a lot of options. This is another section where you could come up with your own option. I'm going to offer a few today. You might have a section called publications, and then you use bullet point statements to sort of quantify and identify the scope of what you've done. So under the section category of publications, I might have a bullet point that says something like published articles in 5 peer-reviewed journals. And if I wanted to emphasize the journals, I could follow this with the Journal of X, the Journal of Y, and so forth. Or maybe I want to focus on the topics that I published on. So published articles in 10 peer-reviewed journals on topics including A, B, and C. So this is just one approach. Some people are pretty effective in combining both of these. And it might be 1 bullet point or 2 bullet point statements. Similarly, presentations, it's mirroring the same kind of approach, presented at 3 international conferences, including this one and that one. Again, think about your audience. Will the human reader or human readers know those conferences, like our employers also at those conferences. So it would be impressive to them to know that you were presenting there. Or is it the topics that you want them to know about? Presented at 3 international conferences on the following topics. I'll just go back there real quick. Another option that I've actually been coaching individuals on quite a bit is you could do something like related presentations, and then in parentheses, put something like 2 out of 10. And so you're showing citations actually for 2, and you're signaling, I have 10. But I'm letting you know these are the related ones. So that works for presentations. That also works for publications. That's a way to preserve the citation format for a couple that you know you want to feature because they're relevant, but then you're showing the full scope that, you know, it's out of this many that I'm featuring here. Additional content sections, Chris went over some of those certainly for resume. Industry loves the word leadership. So anytime you can have a heading called leadership and involvement, that could be a heading, leadership and co-curricular. In terms of academia, service to the institution, service to the department are really important. Community service is another heading. Professional memberships, if you have space for it. Awards, fellowships, and grants. Again, with awards, fellowships, and grants, you could do something like recent fellowships or recent awards and grants. And here it's often a good practice to put why it was awarded. If something was awarded because you were selected out of, you know, hundreds of individuals, or it was awarded because of some particular expertise or excellence that you have, it's great to just put a little description of like why the award was given to you or why you received the grant. And the core 4 are really important that Chris mentioned earlier in terms of writing some of this up as well. References included in a CV, we don't see it included in a resume unless it was asked for. Basically, you give employers exactly what they ask for. If they say, send a CV, you send a CV. If they say, send a resume, that's 1 page, you send a resume that's 1 page. References are pretty common to CVs. It might be a page to itself. If your CV ends on half a page, you might put the individuals that are your references on the second half of that page. And basically it's their contact information. And what we see now pretty frequently is in what capacity the individual knows you. Are they an advisor? Are they a supervisor? Are they your PI? What have you? And then just rounding this out today, we like to keep in mind what we call the 3 C's: consistency, content, clarity. Everything we provided, you know, to you today is certainly indicative of these 3 components of every document. And we go back to kind of being strategic here too. You know, what sections are you going to include? What titles are you going to use for your sections? Is research and teaching going to fall under a title called work experience, or are they going to have separate section titles? If they're separated, there's going to be greater emphasis there. Think about the order, as Chris mentioned. You know, it's the top third for a single page document, the first couple of pages for a longer style CV. Order, really important. Also within your bullet point statements, what I find is that individuals will often write the bullet point statements as they think of them, and then that's how they appear in their document. When that's great, it's a good start, but when you're applying for a position, think about the order of those bullet point statements within each of the experiences that you're describing. Format, we talked about what gets bold, gets more attention. Using those action verbs is critical. Resisting action verbs like assisted with. If I assisted with and Chris assisted with, and you had to pick us, one of us, you wouldn't know what I did versus what Chris did. So those kinds of phrases, responsible for, helped with, assisted with, it's usually like much more effective to pick a single action verb that best describes the skill that you're trying to feature. And I think that's it for this. Chris, anything to add on this slide?
Nope, I think you hit everything right on here.
All right.
We have one more question. Oh,
Great,
perfect timing,
that's where
perfect
we're
timing. Just in the chat, should these action verbs, assisted with, etc., be avoided in an undergrad student's resume?
Yeah, so for undergraduate students, we definitely encourage them to avoid the use of those phrases for a couple different reasons. One, we want to, again, showcase the idea of trying to match those keywords, right? Trying to align with the job description, trying to demonstrate their skills in action. So, it's not simply just saying I have communication skills, take my word for it. We're showing through those action verbs how they've demonstrated and utilized those communication skills. Second reason with undergraduate students in particular, where we try to coach them away from the idea of using assisted with, responsible for, is because that encourages them to just see their developmental as kind of like assigned to them as just tasks they performed. It doesn't really encourage them to think outside of the box as far as how they are growing these skill sets. So for example, something we typically see with students in undergraduate is that they worked as a part of a wait staff at a restaurant. And so they might just say, well, I took customers' orders or I served food. You didn't just serve food. Think about the actions that you exemplified. Think about what you had to do as part of that serving food. Maybe, and yes, the taking the orders, maybe you were providing menu recommendations. Maybe you were trying to encourage people to try something new, which is showing a little bit more of their persuasion skills or those verbal communication skills. Or maybe you had to try and upsell to, oh, you ordering the Cosmopolitan. Well, would you like our ultimate Cosmopolitan, to try and upsell and really work on those sales skills? So to think more about I didn't just assist, I actually had a functional part of this that led to an impact of something. And so we try to encourage avoiding of that. The only time we do recommend using like assisted with is if it's in a position where they physically assisted, like a veterinarian assistant. There is some level of assisting with surgical procedures because they can't perform that. In those cases, yes, assisted with would be okay. But in typical use, try to avoid that. I don't know if we have any other questions that anybody would like to share with us. So I'm seeing a lot come in really quickly from my chat, but I think I'm missing some. So Jillian, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
I can read them out too, no problem. Okay, so the first question, could you clarify when the qualification versus objective sections are used?
Sure. And Chris and I, we might differ a little on this, and I would say that that's okay as well. I think something that we recognize is that there are like many sort of right ways, to do things, and we're always being informed by our professional societies and others who are doing our kind of work as well. So in my coaching of graduate students, once somebody is applying for something, a job, an internship, they have a qualifications section to show how they're qualified for the thing they're applying to. If they were to show up at a career fair, they could have a summary, because at the career fair, they might just be sort of sampling different employers. The exception is that on a CV for academic jobs, it is not a common practice to have a qualifications section. I could see that that might emerge in that, like, just in the time I've been doing this work, a lot has changed. But CV, resume, industry or organization, graduate level individual, qualifications when you're applying for a position.
And from the undergraduate perspective, the idea of really more of that objective or summary would really, one, I guess, boil down to the individual's amount of experiences. So if there's an individual that maybe hasn't had a lot of experiential opportunities, whether that's volunteer or part-time work or what have you, they typically don't have a large amount of information to summarize. So in that case, typically an objective would be more what they're used for. If it's somebody who maybe has extensive experience in working in a lab, plus they had some part-time job experience waiting tables, plus they've been involved in a lot of activities on campus where they have some leadership opportunities, and they have a little bit more too that they're trying to communicate, then a summary for an undergraduate might be beneficial. A time where we tell students on the resume if those are even needed or not, is also considering the content of the document. So if the majority of the information that your reader is looking at speaks directly to them, then the idea of an objective or summary might not be needed at all. So for example, like an engineering resume, a nursing resume, typically a lot of the experiences that one is going to possess in those fields are going to be directly related. So they don't need to reiterate the same information over and over in that case. If a student was planning on applying to, say, the marketing industry, where again, maybe they only had some lifeguarding experience, some retail experience, maybe some academics, then that's where the objective might be a little bit more helpful to help the reader make sense of what they're seeing so they know how to pull out those skills that are needed versus just taking things at face value.
And our other question was, I've seen some resumes with photos or headshots. Is this a new thing now?
So for, again, as Kay mentioned at the beginning of this conversation is very much rooted in domestic US based resumes and documents. And traditionally for US, you would not see headshots or information like that on a resume. We would recommend removing that. One, just from, employment practices, it's not something that exists as it does in other countries. But two, as Kay mentioned before about ageism existing, we all know that there's a lot of unconscious bias that exists in the realm of employers. Or individuals, readers in general. So to try and remove that information as much as possible and let your experiences speak for themselves and your qualifications speak for themselves is what the individual should be focusing on. Kay, if you have more information that you want to add to that.
Yeah, I worked actually with a student this morning who had a photo, and we talked about it in terms of they were going to go to a conference and they wanted to sort of be memorable to the people that they were meeting with at the conference. And so for them, like, it was very situational. They followed all the other practices that Chris and I shared today. And they said, I do want to put my photo on here because I'm going to be talking to lots of people and they might not remember who I was. And so for me, it wasn't like a right or a wrong. It wasn't going to be scanned by an applicant tracking system. So it wasn't going to get, mess up anything there. It wasn't being used to formally apply for something. So I think in that context, it, made sense for that individual. And it was just a little thumbnail that was in the corner of the document. But in terms of once somebody is actually applying, not recommended to include the photo or any information like age, family structure, any of that in the US context.
Awesome. Well, if anyone has any more questions, I'm sure you can reach out, but I just wanted to take a minute and thank Kay and Kristen for a great presentation. This was really, really informative. I also wanted to put a link into the chat. This is the Career Champion Program's upcoming events. If you want to be one of the first people to know about trainings like this, we send out a monthly newsletter, and I'll be reaching out with a little bit more information about how to join the program or how to register for an information session if you want to speak, one-on-one with someone and actually learn more about the benefits than I could tell you in this 10-second little moment. But yeah, so thanks everyone so much for coming. This was really great. And thanks again to Kristen and Kay. Bye-bye.